Hello, it's Helen. Today I'm going to be talking to the excellent Fiona Woollard from the University of Southampton about fairness in child rearing. That's the basic topic. So, Fiona, imagine, if you will, that you and I are a couple, and we decide that we're going to have a baby, and you get to be the one that actually has the baby. And we're really invested in fairly distributing the work associating with childcare. But my attitude is, look, okay, you went through the pregnancy, you gave birth to the child, but basically the question of fairness sort of like starts day one is the day when, baby arrives back in the house, and we start from there. Now, as I understand it, that is not your view. So what's wrong with that view?
So I think that day one of the parenting project starts well before birth and certainly includes pregnancy. And pregnancy and birth involve unique or distinctive burdens that the gestational parent, the person who is pregnant, takes on. And that this means that the non-gestational parent owes them some kind of compensation for these distinctive burdens.
Right, compensation. Okay. So can you say something about what the burdens are that the gestational parent is bearing?
So there are quite a few different types of burdens. The most straightforward ones are risks to your physical health. So there are lots of, I don't want to put anybody off becoming pregnant or having children, but it does include quite significant risks to health. This can range from nausea and vomiting during pregnancy to gestational diabetes, which can be life-threatening, to the damage that can happen during birth. You may have a cesarean section, which is major surgery, involves cutting through several layers of your abdomen, or you may have a vaginal birth, and I think 85% of vaginal births involve perineal trauma or tears, with large numbers of those involving quite significant tears and involving lifelong effects.
That's lovely.
So
Thank you.
I just realized I only said the physical burdens, and then there were so many of those that I stopped talking. So there are also other burdens which are kind of harder to put your finger on, but I think that gestation challenges your sense of yourself and your relationship to your body. So most of the time, if you're lucky, you understand your body as something that is a part of you, something that's organized around your well-being, and your body basically functions for you. And during pregnancy, that can kind of switch, and suddenly your body is doing things which are geared towards the well-being and the birth of the fetus rather than your own well-being and comfort. I think one quite silly example that I had was that when I was pregnant, all the ligaments in my body relaxed. This is something that happens in order to allow the baby to pass safely out of your body. But it also means that my eyesight changed and I suddenly needed to have glasses, despite having spent quite a lot of money on laser surgery so that I didn't have to wear glasses. And my feet also grew several sizes, so I had to get new shoes. Those were quite mild consequences, but there was this general sense of your body kind of changing its what you might call teleology, what its governing principle, which can lead to a kind of alienation from your body. There are also really extreme moral demands placed on us during pregnancy. We have to think about how our behavior will affect the fetus. And because there's no break from being pregnant, you can't really go away and do something without it potentially affecting the fetus. So these moral demands can be quite kind of pervasive and quite demanding. There's also an effect on your kind of bodily integrity. So pregnancy itself involves a really intimate engagement with the fetus. The fetus is inside your body. Maggie Little describes pregnancy as being inhabited by the fetus, but it also requires you to consent, or often involves consenting to quite uncomfortable and unwanted intimate physical contact, whether this is for the sake of the fetus or in order to protect yourself from the possible effects of pregnancy. So this can involve vaginal ultrasounds, cervical sweeps, and generally unpleasant things which involve letting health professionals do things to you that you wouldn't normally enjoy.
That is actually quite a lot, and it's not just giving up drinking, is it? There's a whole load of other stuff that you have to think about. I see that you're still wearing glasses. Did your feet shrink back again?
No,
Oh,
no, they didn't.
Wow, that's amazing. I had no idea that your feet could grow. Wow. So that's quite a lot of burdens, but you might think, well, okay, yeah, burdens, but look, you get to be the one who is going through the joy of pregnancy and childbirth. That's a kind of benefit that, I, as your imagined co-parent, am not going through, right? There's the bond that comes from being the one that was carrying the baby. So does that not cancel out? Like, okay, so I need to compensate you for the burdens, but you need to compensate me for the fact that I didn't get to go through that experience and have that bond.
So I do that. Even though I talk about the burdens of pregnancy, I do think that pregnancy can be amazing. And I'm incredibly glad that I was able to carry my children and that I was the one who carried them. However, I don't think that we should think of them as cancelling out. I think that fairness in co-parenting should involve not just kind of overall equality of benefits and burdens, it should involve as much fairness as possible in the type of burdens and benefits. And the default shouldn't be that one person ends up with these very significant burdens and has to take the benefits as compensation. I think that's actually kind of unfair to the gestational parent, kind of most dramatically, but it's also unfair to the non-gestational parent if they're kind of relegated to a parent who never gets who just kind of accepts that they don't have that special bond. So I think that what we want to do is think about dividing up parental duties after birth in a way that takes into account both the benefits and the burdens of pregnancy, and gives the gestational parent a bit of a kind of break, a bit of being let off some of the sacrifices that they might have made or that come along with being a parent, and give the non-gestational parent a chance to take up more of those burdens and more of the associated benefits of that relationship with the child. I don't propose that this is going to be the same for everybody. I think that a default is that you take on more of the sacrifices involved in parental duties after birth. But I recognize that people are different, parents are different, and there might be all sorts of reasons to kind of negotiate away from that. But I think the situation we're in at the moment is that we just kind of ignore the benefits and burdens, and actually people assume that if anybody's going to sacrifice more, it's going to be the mother or it's going to be the gestational parent. And I think what we need to do is kind of flip that assumption and have a habit, a practice of taking into account the burdens and the benefits of pregnancy and thinking about how to share those fairly.
That's really nice. So yeah, so I was thinking of it in terms of, and I think you might have mentioned compensation, which sounds terribly sort of transactional. It's a bit like, your flight's cancelled and the airline gives you 100 quid. But you're sort of more thinking in terms of, I mean, it sort of is compensation, but it's like, let's think about the things that the burdens and also the upsides of that whole process, and then thinking of the compensation sort of in that light, right? So one of you, by virtue of not being the gestational parent, has not had various burdens, but also not had various benefits, and you sort of, as it were, tailor the compensation a bit to that, right? So you don't have that kind of bond with the child. Well, that's the thing. It would be really good for you to, nurture to the extent that you can, having not been the gestational parent. So it's a sort of benefit in kind, right? It's like they can't have that thing, but they can have something that sort of approximates to it or something.
Yeah, so I use the term compensation because I think they are really distinctive burdens, and you can't you can't make things fair. So
Right.
it's there isn't a way of kind of fairly sharing the burdens of pregnancy, given that only one person can be pregnant for a given child. So because it can't be really, we can't have a fair or equal distribution. That's why I use the word compensation, so that we recognize that there's this kind of residue, or that it's going to be a kind of imperfect. So I take the word compensation to kind of be appropriate when it's not possible to make things completely fair. So you compensate.
Right.
So that's why I use that word. Yeah.
Right. No, that makes sense. Right. You have a cesarean. There's no
Yeah.
there's nothing to balance that out. The only thing I can do is compensate you in some other way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Unless your child happens to need an organ later in life, and then you
Oh.
might think that actually is similar enough that it balances out.
Oh, that's
Um,
interesting. Right. So you might
so,
want to keep that debt in reserve just in case you have to pay it out later on.
well, I hope not. So most parents don't end up in a position where they need their child needs an organ. And actually, even if you do, you can't guarantee you're going to be
Right.
able to, because it really depends on the match. So I think the best thing is to try and equalize things in the afterbirth, in that day-to-day childcare, using a kind of increased sacrifices associated with that, to get things as fair as possible. And then in the event that you are in the situation where your child needs an organ, then the non-gestational parent is kind of first in line. Although then you might need to pay back some of the original compensation that you got, if that doesn't get too transactional.
So that's really nice. Yeah, because I was sort of going to ask you about sort of like what forms the compensation might take, but you've said quite a lot about that. How about this as a form of compensation? All right, you, Fiona, you've gone through pregnancy and childbirth. Now, what I'm going to do, child comes home, I'm just going to take the child, and or you just go off on your holidays for 9 months, do whatever you like, take your maternity leave and go and lie on a beach somewhere, and I'll take care of the child for 9 months. Would that work? I mean, apart from the health risks and everything.
I mean, I'm sure we've all had moments when that sounded quite attractive. But I don't think that's a good idea. So I think when we're doing this division of parental duties, we need to think about both parents' interests in spending time with their child. We need to think about the fact that there is an existing bond. There's a great paper by Teresa Barron where she argues that parents have duties to have rights to kind of have their children with them. Gestational mothers have those duties, even in cases where actually they're not in a fit state to take on full parental duties. So I think, as Barron points out, there's something really traumatic about being separated from the child that you've just given birth to, even if it's to go lie on a beach somewhere. So, and also we need to keep take those interests into account, and it's not going to be anything like as dramatic as off you go for 9 months. I also think it's going to be much longer lasting. So because it's not going to be so dramatic, the kind of rate of compensation is going to be really quite slow. So I believe that my husband has now reached the point where he no longer needs to compensate me. My youngest child is 11. And I'm actually reflecting on this because I think when I started writing this paper, I didn't feel that he'd reached that point. So he's reached it sometime in the length it takes to write this paper. So yeah, it's gonna last kind of quite a long time, more than 9 months, and it's not going to be a right, you take full responsibility for the child. It's going to be something more messy, more nuanced than that.
So what you're saying, unless this paper has taken you, 10 years to write, which I take it hasn't, you're talking years. You're not talking, weeks or months. It's years. Wow. Well, it's good that you got to that point eventually.
Yes.
Slow burn though. Yeah. Wow.
He's very good though. He's very good.
Did you tell him that he's now reached the point where he doesn't need to pay you back anymore?
I'm a bit wary about doing this because when I mentioned the topic of the paper, he didn't like it very much.
Okay, well, don't tell him about this video then, because he'll find out.
I just won't mention it to him.
Yeah, no. That's all really interesting, Fiona. Is there anything else that you sort of on this topic that you have a burning desire to tell me?
I realised that I forgot to mention some very important interests that we need to take into account in dividing up the parental duties, and that's the child's interests.
Oh yeah.
So we take into account everybody involved, the child and the parents, because children sometimes have kind of preferences for certain things to be done by one parent rather than the other, and we have to work with that, I think.
That is a very important caveat. Thank you for that. It's been so nice to talk to you, Fiona. Thank you so much. That's all really interesting. Thank you.